Hey, everyone. Thanks so much for joining us for Ask the Expert North Texas. I'm Kristen Diaz.
I'm David Rankin. It's a crime that has just literally shocked the community of Cleveland, Texas. What happens when a guy is firing off an assault-style rifle in his backyard and the next-door neighbor comes over and says, "Could you please tone it down? My child is trying to sleep." And the guy comes over to his house, the police say, and shoots the entire family. On today's Ask the Expert, we're joined by Dr. Alex Del Carmen. He's a criminology professor at Tarleton State. He is in the KRLD Zoom room. Dr. Del Carmen, thank you so much for the time.
Thanks for having me, David.
When you heard about this crime in Cleveland, Texas, what's your first thought that came up?
Unfortunately, I wasn't surprised, right? Because of the fact that we've seen so many of these crimes take place in the past few weeks where individual homeowners are taking the law and really abusing it, right? And to some extent, not even understanding it fully. And for the sake of quote unquote being protected, they're actually engaging in lethal force, which obviously results in the death of innocent people. It's very sad, but it also is a measure of the times in which we live right now.
How do we get gun owners to be more educated on the law? What's the process there? We just assume that people know their rights and know what the law is.
That's a really good question, Kristen. And I think that what we've seen across the United States in the past few years, particularly since the pandemic, is people in general have been acquiring guns because they feel unsafe, right? They feel that somehow crime is blowing up, which we know it's increasing. And they also feel that what happened in New York City yesterday or day before, it's going to happen in rural Texas today because social media simply sends that message right away. So as a result of that, we know, and we've studied this enough to know that fear drives people to do certain things, right? And one of the things that it drives people to do is acquire guns. But to your question and to your point, one of the hard things to do is we don't communicate to them what exactly are the responsibilities and the do's and don'ts once they have that gun, right? And it's really bizarre that we do that with cars. Like we give people licenses to drive a car, and then we also put them through a test. But you can go, if you have a relatively clean background, you can go at the age of 21 and above, go anywhere and buy a weapon, and in some cases 18 and above, and buy a gun and have absolutely no idea what the rules, the laws, and the do's and don'ts are of owning that weapon. That is just bizarre.
This is not an issue of stand your ground either, because if the gentleman next door, the accused shooter, is worrying about his property, the only thing the other guy did was come over and say, "Would you please stop?" And then he left the property to go back home.
Right. And so that goes to show you that everyone out there that has a dog barking, next door, or somebody that has music that's really loud past 10 o'clock at night, you better be careful because you have absolutely no idea how that person is going to respond, right? And so, what is to do is call, law enforcement and let them handle it, right? Or if you have an HOA, let them handle it. But clearly what we see here is that people are acting irrationally for things that would have otherwise been normative in our society. Somebody telling somebody, "Hey, can you please, not shoot in the backyard because, we have kids that are asleep and, those bullets have to come down somewhere at some point." And unfortunately, this guy just basically decided that was the ignition to his violent trend. And then he ended up killing 5 people. And, it breaks my heart for the families. It breaks my heart for that dad that was crying and sobbing, in the news yesterday. But it also is a very, very scary thing for the rest of us in Texas to realize that people are at that emotional state right now.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, I live in the inner city where there's gunshots every other night. And you look on, apps like Nextdoor, and people are saying, "Did you hear that? Did you hear that? How many rounds did you hear?" And it gets to a point where it's almost you get desensitized to it, or you just don't even know whether or not you're going to get any response from law enforcement anymore because they're so overwhelmed with calls like this.
Yeah, as you guys may know, I've trained all the chiefs of police in Texas, since 2001, and I work very closely with law enforcement. And talking to a couple of chiefs, in Texas just over the weekend, they were telling me that the response time is between 8 and 15 minutes in some of these cities. And so, which is for by the way, the critical calls, right? Not necessarily calls to do a report, but and it's really alarming to me that we see a decline of individuals that are interested in joining law enforcement. We now have police academies that are 1/3 filled. We have police departments that are lowering their standards. We have the economy, which is shifting and in very soft ground. We have the post-pandemic labor market, which is very, very, very fragile right now. And then we have people that are simply their fuse is very, very short on just about anything. And if you don't believe me, get on a flight anywhere, right? Or get on a bus somewhere, or get in a taxi somewhere where you have to share that time with somebody. And you just never know how that person is going to react for very basic conversations that you can have with another human being.
Let's still go to the investigation for just a second. The FBI and local police are saying that they literally have no clues as to where this guy is. How much of that is true, and how much of it is they cannot divulge what they do know so as to possibly spook the guy into running again?
It's a little bit of both, David. I think that they probably have some clues, but I bet you that the clues that they have are not where they want to be right now at this point in the investigation. So you got to look at it as we criminologists look at this, right? So you've got a bad guy who fled the scene. He's armed. He's already taken 5 lives. And so by virtue of that, we can pretty much predict that wherever this guy goes, he's going to continue on that killing spree if given the opportunity and given a reason to kill. So that's why we call him very dangerous. Now, the bad part about this investigation, from what I know, is the fact that the FBI found his cell phone. And typically when bad guys take their cell phones with them, we are able to ping or use the towers to be able to, geospatially localize as to where he is and be able to track him down, right? Number 2 is this guy is somebody that can blend in pretty much anywhere. And Houston is close enough to the border where he can easily have crossed that border already into Mexico and get lost in Mexico with contacts that he may have. Now, we have the best law enforcement in the world, and Texas law enforcement is amazing in the things that we do. I think that, we're not perfect, but I often argue that it is among the best of the best. I have no doubt that the Bureau is on him like crazy, but I do believe that the evidence is not where it needs to be, and that people are afraid. They're probably afraid of calling if somebody looks like him because they're going to be accused of racial profiling. And in some other cases, they're afraid of calling because they don't want to be in the middle of it. This guy is highly violent, right? So there may be a little bit of both.
And can we talk about also just one of the leading cause of deaths for kids is gunfire? And that we have kids that were killed in this instance. I mean, whether they were targeted or just bystanders or just an effect of this man's rage, whatever you want to call it, we continue to lose our kids to guns. Is there, how does law enforcement feel right now? As you say, you work with a lot of the different chiefs. How is that battle for them right now? What are they doing to change that?
It's a really good question, but it's a policy related question more so than an enforcement question, right? Law enforcement is limited as to what they can do. And, they have programs in the community where they make people aware of having a gun and leaving it in a place that is safe. And they give out locks, for people to use with their own guns. But at the same time, Kristen, part of the problem is that, at some point in the past 10 to 15 years, criminals have lost, quote unquote, respect for children and for the elderly. And if you really think about the criminal mind in the past 25, 30 years, we've had horrible crimes, but for the most part, there's been sort of these unofficial rules, right? That criminals used to not harm little kids. Criminals would not go after elderly people. And so even the mafia used to have rules, when it comes to who got hit and who did not. Now what we're seeing is that it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter your age. It doesn't matter where you are. They could get you at church, school, pre-K, place of work, place of worship. It doesn't matter where. If you have the person that is there armed with the wrong motives, they're going to take out anybody. Yeah. And so I think what that does for the law enforcement community is it really, really increases the vulnerability, but also the level of awareness. And that I, as a criminologist, for instance, have when I go somewhere and I see little kids walking around, it's no longer a safe place to be.
What is it about 2023 that has turned into the land of mass shootings? Yesterday alone, our country had 8 of them. where at least 4 people are injured. This doesn't even include the shooting in Texas. And we're well over 170 of them so far this year.
It's funny you asked that, David, because I belong to an entity at Tarleton State. We founded this institute about 3 years ago, which is called IPAC. IPAC is the Institute for Predictive Analytics in Criminal Justice. And we actually wrote a pretty comprehensive report on mass shootings and also specifically school shootings. And what we found is since 1966 all the way up to 2022, what we found is that there are patterns that we just simply are not good at tracking, but there's entities that do track it, and we were able to analyze it. And what we see is that 2023 seems to almost be the culmination year of a lot of these things that we've seen sort of evolve, very slowly. Now, the bigger question for me as a criminologist is it the last year of these sort of explosive instances, or is this really the beginning of the new normal, which is really in itself very alarming? Because 2023, in comparison to how we're going to look back at 2023 in 2025, hopefully this is not the case, but it may very well be one of the most peaceful years we've had in comparison to 2025.
Wow.
It's absolutely frightening.
Yeah, absolutely it is. And, more and more people are buying guns. We talk about, the laws and knowing what you should and shouldn't do, but, also with law enforcement, I mean, anybody could be carrying now at this point. Does that help or hurt them with certain situations? What does the studies show about that?
Yeah, so it's been politicized, right, Kristen? I mean, I always tell people I'm not a politician. I'm a criminologist. I look at science, I look at data, and I've been doing this for a quarter of a century. So I can tell you that it depends on who you ask, right? The argument that some folks make is that if you have guns and you have access to guns, you're able to protect your family whenever cops, cannot show up at the doorstep. Now, I believe that wholeheartedly, and I just for full disclosure, I am a huge believer of the Second Amendment, but I do believe that Second Amendment has to be carried out with responsibility. We can't just give ARs, to people that are 18 years old and are going to parade down the street with the AR because we have a Second Amendment. We have to train people to use guns. We have to make sure they use it at the right time in the right place. But I will tell you also that the more these events happen, the more media coverage that they have, the more people are going to go out there and buy guns. That's going to happen, period.
Yeah.
Dr. Alex Del Carmen is criminologist at Tarleton State. Dr. Del Carmen, it's always informative to talk to you.
Yeah.
Thank you so much for having me, guys.